In this episode of Behind the Headlines, we step into one of the most contested landscapes on Earth. Not merely a strip of territory between a river and a sea, but a battlefield of history, law, memory, religion, and narrative. Because the conflict over Israel is no longer simply about borders, it is about truth itself. What happens when history is rewritten in real time? When legal foundations are buried beneath slogans? When archaeology, diplomacy, religion, terrorism, nationalism, and even international law all collide in one tiny piece of land no larger than a speck on the atlas. As comedian Yochai Sponder said, it is the only place on an atlas where the name of the country doesn't even fit on it. More than a century, the modern Middle East has been shaped by decisions made in the aftermath of empire. Balfour Declaration, San Remo Conference, the League of Nations, British Mandate, United Nations Partition Plan. Yet today, few people know how those decisions were made, what legal force they carried, or why they still matter. Instead, we inhabit a world of memes, outrage, and moral inversion, where history is compressed into hashtags and complexity is treated as betrayal. My guest on this episode has spent decades pushing back against this tide. Hugh Kitson is a British and Australian documentary filmmaker whose work has focused on Israel, Jewish history, and the legal foundations of the modern Jewish state. His latest documentary series, Whose Land?, examines the historical and legal claims surrounding Israel and the West Bank, and the wider conflict that continues to convulse the Middle East and, increasingly, as we know, the West itself. But this particular conversation goes further than law, because underneath the geopolitics lies something deeper, a civilizational struggle over identity, legitimacy, memory, and meaning. A struggle between competing versions of history, competing visions of justice, and perhaps even competing visions of the sacred itself. So in this episode, we ask the difficult questions about truth, about sovereignty, about nationalism, about religion, and about peace, and whether this conflict is ultimately political or something far older and far deeper. Hugh Kitson, UK and Australian documentary filmmaker, welcome to Behind the Headlines. It's a privilege having you today.
Thank you very much. It's a privilege to be here, Adam.
Hugh, you've spent a large part of your life as a documentary filmmaker on docos related to Israel. What's the connection for you? Why is that been part of what you've been doing for so long?
Well, it's to do with my Christian faith, actually. I've made documentaries on a good many subjects, but over the last 25 years, I've concentrated on Israel. I had an interest in Israel as a young Christian. I saw a documentary called His Land, which was produced by the Billy Graham organization, and it featured Cliff Richard. It was like a musical documentary through the land of Israel, and it was made just after the Six-Day War of 1967, and it was about biblical prophecy being fulfilled in the restoration of Israel in our lifetime, really. And that was the hook that started my interest in Israel. I was absolutely fascinated as a young Christian to see biblical prophecy going back thousands of years fulfilled in my lifetime.
And what was the first documentary that you created?
On Israel, I did a documentary which I was commissioned to make called The Last Generation. And that was back in the 1970s, 50 years ago now.
And what was that about?
Well, it was taking a section of scripture. Actually, it was Psalm 102. And Psalm 102 is the first 10, 12 verses are actually a rather shocking picture of the Holocaust. If you can imagine the imagery portrayed in that psalm, you see a picture of the Holocaust. But then the whole thing changes. And it goes on to say, "For the Lord will arise and have mercy upon Zion, for the time to favor her. Yes, the set time has come." And really, since 1948, we've seen Zion built up. And it's really an incredible fulfillment of prophecy. And it goes on to say, "When the Lord shall build up Zion, he shall appear in his glory." And then verse 18 says, "And this shall be written for the generation to come." Now, that's what the English translations of the Bible say. Now, I'm not a Hebrew scholar, but I do know Hebrew scholars. But the Hebrew there actually says, "Lador Aharon," which is probably best translated, "the last generation." So that was the title of the film.
Mm. Or the following generation. I've just got to share with you at a personal level, my favorite sort of biblical line related to Jewish history is, and I'll never forget the moment. Many years ago, I was an activist in student politics, and we worked for the release of the Ethiopian Jews
Oh, yes.
out of Ethiopia, from Gondor in Ethiopia to Israel. It was very political at the time. But when it started to happen and the first Ethiopians touched down in Israel and came off that plane, and the image of the Ethiopian kissing the tarmac with this 707 or 727, whatever it was, behind them, and it was a moment in space and time I'll never forget, where the line, I think it's from Isaiah, but I'm not sure, and it's, "On the wings of eagles,
Mm.
the lost tribes shall return." And it was that clash. I feel what you're saying, that clash and that moment of intense spirituality amidst the physical reality that we are experiencing. I'll never forget it. So, Hugh, I think I feel that what you're describing, it's a very, very powerful emotion, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. Actually, something I must share with you about the last generation, because it was really made for Christians to understand the times we're living in. But believe it or not, the Channel 9 network actually broadcasted on Israel's 30th anniversary in May 1977. That would never happen today.
No, that would never. No, certainly not Channel 9. So we're going to talk about the latest documentary you've made with Richard Kemp, which I'm really interested
Yeah.
in seeing, and you sent me the trailers, and I've had a good look at that and done a bit of work, and that's called Whose Land? But there was a documentary before that that sort of sets up Whose Land? Tell us about that.
I've made a few. Oh, yes, The Forsaken Promise. That's right. Yes, we made The Forsaken Promise in the noughties. And it's really about the British Mandate. And we do touch on it again in the first part of Whose Land, but not in the detail of The Forsaken Promise. And really, one of the reasons we made this was that British people knew nothing about the Mandate. It's an area of history that basically has been buried, certainly in Britain, because, to just sum it up very quickly, Britain betrayed her legal obligations in the Mandate, which we cover in Whose Land as well. In fact, Whose Land is more about the legal side than the moral side of it, which The Forsaken Promise does. But the long and short of it is that the 1939 White Paper, which was a complete betrayal of the Balfour Declaration and a violation of the mandate that Britain signed up to, actually resulted in the deaths of at least hundreds of thousands of Jews who could have escaped Nazi Europe and returned to their homeland. Because Britain basically, with the 1939 White Paper, not only shut the door to immigration and land sales, but much more seriously decided that the Jewish population of what was then called Palestine would not exceed more than 1/3. In other words, the whole idea of self-determination for the Jewish people in their ancient homeland was scrapped. And so that is really what the Forsaken Promise is actually about. But we covered many things in that, and among them was the Hebron massacre of 1929. And we were very privileged to have an interview with a survivor who was a lady called Rivka Berg, who was 8 years old when that happened, and members of her family were killed. We've got a raft of people who appeared in that film. We've even got an eyewitness to Allenby's entry into Jerusalem in 1917. We've got others like Shlomo Hillel, who was probably the last of Israel's founding fathers to die. He's not well known, but he was a very close friend of Shimon Peres. And he was mainly responsible for getting 130,000 Jews out of Iraq between 1946 and 51. And he had quite a political career in the Knesset. And he was Speaker of the Knesset from 84 to 88, before he retired from politics. And Shlomo became a personal friend of mine until he departed this life about 5 years ago. So he's another of the people who took part in it. And yet another was Yossi Harel, who was commander of the Exodus operation,
Yes.
1947. And so it was timely to make it then, because almost no one who appeared in that film is alive today.
You talked about Rivka and the story of 1929 Hebron, which was my previous podcast in interviewing our Dennis Schwartz, the historian
Yeah.
of that period. And one of the themes, Hugh, that came out of that conversation that I'm hearing is going to be a subtext of this conversation is historical truth versus political realities. And political realities can become moral inversions, as we see now, of course, and so unfortunately. And the other theme that Yardena talked a lot about, and probably the most common word in our conversation, was disinformation.
Yeah.
The lack of understanding of historical truth, black or white, good or bad. It's not about either side. Everybody has their view of truth, but the fundamental realities upon which all this is grounded. The White Paper of 1939 was a disaster for Jewish immigration and could have saved many people. Shoah. You've gone on now to create this new documentary, Whose Land? Tell us about the documentary, and I know it's a series. Who's featuring in it, and what purpose have you got in mind with it?
Well, it's interesting. It's been, for me, a long-term project, and it's not looking at any sort of biblical side of it or prophetic side of it. As you've just said, that history is being rewritten, And I first became really aware of this in the early 1990s. It was starting to happen then. And I wrote a treatment for a film based on a published book called Whose Promised Land. And it just looks at the verified history of the lead up to the rebirth of Israel from really the time of the Balfour Declaration up until Israel's reestablishment in 1948, and even beyond that through the wars. And this whole story is being inverted. And I really felt that the truth needed to come out. Now, in those days, I had a very little understanding of international law or the legal ramifications. I was aware of the fact that the San Remo resolution of 1920 really gave the Balfour Declaration. It raised what was really a letter of intent by the British government to the level of an international treaty. Now, the thing about the San Remo resolution was that it was fully endorsed, unanimously endorsed by all 51 nations of the League of Nations. And that, of course, came out of the Paris Peace Conference of 1919, as did the San Remo Conference itself. And that was really the limit of my understanding of the legal side of it. But in 2010, there was a commemoration of the San Remo Conference. It's on the 90th anniversary of the San Remo Conference, actually at the Villa d'Evesham, which is where it took place. And there are a whole lot of lawyers there. And that was really where I started to get a grasp of the legal side, which of course is based on Israel's history. And I felt it was very important. It sort of revived the whole whose land thing, which had been sitting in my filing cabinet for nearly 20 years by that point. And so I started to look at it more seriously. And really, I suppose you could say that the last 15 years plus, I've been pretty immersed in this particular project.
So let's get the chronology here. We're talking about the legal foundations of the modern state of Israel. So in 1917, Balfour, who's the foreign minister of Britain, sends a letter to Weizmann, who's the head of the Zionist movement. The British government views positively the establishment of a Jewish homeland in what was then Palestine. And in 1920, the League of Nations has a committee meeting at San Remo, which validates completely the claim of the Balfour Declaration to view an establishment of a Jewish homeland as a matter of international law. And the League of Nations approves that. We come to the United Nations. We come to the British Mandate, which is given responsibility after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire at the end of World War. And the British have decided in the establishment of that mandate that due to things like the Hebron massacre and the Arab revolt against Jewish immigration, which had been occurring, they decide to restrict Jewish immigration, and this comes out in the Peel Commission and the 1939 White Paper. They're going to restrict Jewish immigration because the local Arab population are opposed to it. After this, and Britain is a diminished power after World War II, goes to the United Nations now for assessment of the mandate and take us through the link between the legal status of the League of Nations 1920 proposition and the United Nations. The fact that League of Nations no longer exists, what does that mean for the United Nations decision-making and status of decisions that the League itself had made.
Right. If I can just go back to the mandate, and the preamble to the mandate has a little phrase in it, which is absolutely key, that the historical connection of the Jewish people to the land that was called Palestine at that time is recognized, and their right to reconstitute their homeland. In other words, there was a recognition of the history, and so the legal right for them to reconstitute their homeland is given. And that is what is valid today in international law. So let's come from the dissolution of the League of Nations, which happened in 1946, and the foundation of the United Nations, which replaced it. Now, in the United Nations Founding Charter, which again is an international treaty with the force of international law behind it, it's a legal document, in other words, included in that is Article 80. Now, Article 80 of the United Nations recognizes the rights given to all the beneficiaries of the mandates that the League of Nations supervised and agreed to. So the rights given to everyone, whether it's the Arabs in the other Middle East mandates or the indigenous population of, say, West Africa or whatever, they are recognized in the foundation of the United Nations. So that's what gives it the legal force today, is Article 80.
Okay. So the League of Nations divides through the major powers, specifically then Britain and France, creates the Middle East as we know it today, which is Transjordan and Iraq and Syria and Lebanon. And some of those boundaries are historical and very few actually are, and then the mandate of Palestine with a Jewish and Arab population. So the League of Nations decisions then flow into the United Nations under Article 80 and is legitimized. And then we have, of course, the process of the United Nations and the subcommittees, which Australia, of course, Doc Evatt, once leader of the Labor Party, is the chair of the Palestine Committee and recommends a creation of a modern state of Israel, and that is passed by the United Nations. That's the legal story.
Yeah.
So what is the documentary of Whose Land? Tell us about why you created, if it's a straightforward proposition, and I know nothing is straightforward, of course, in history or law, tell us about the documentary Whose Land and the role of Richard Kemp in all of this.
Right. Well, it started out, it has become, let's say, 2 feature-length documentaries. The first one goes up to Israel's independence. So it looks at the historic and legal issues that led to the foundation of Israel in 1948. And the second part starts in 1948 and goes through all of the wars that Israel has fought, except this one. We actually completed the production just before October the 7th. So there's nothing about that. So the second part of it actually looks at Israel's legal rights to Judea and Samaria, which is a real hot potato. And the United Nations refer to it as occupied Palestinian territory. And our team of lawyers, and we've got a fantastic team of lawyers who take part in this, and Richard Kemp, Colonel Richard Kemp, he really narrates and ties the whole thing together. He's key to the whole thing. But we're actually debunking the idea of Judea and Samaria, which is the original name rather than the West Bank. We actually look at the origin of where the West Bank designation came from. It really looks at what established principles of international law say when applied to this situation. When I say established principles of international law, I mean principles that apply to all other nations. Now, one of these principles, which comes out in the second part, is something known as uti possidetis juris. And basically, that is a universal default situation. When a new nation comes into being, it inherits the borders of what existed immediately beforehand. And this is applied to all of the countries that gained independence from the mandates previously. When the Soviet Union broke up into the various different countries that now exist, they all had their borders, including Ukraine. So, in other words, the Russian invasion of Ukraine is illegal under international law because they're seizing property that belongs to someone else by force. And those borders were the borders when Ukraine and Russia became independent countries. Same applies to Israel. So that is just one of the principles that I always look at.
This is where it starts. Many, many facets, prisms start to collide.
Yes.
We've talked so far of the legal claims to Israel, and I know your documentary goes into legal claims around the West Bank, Judea, Samaria, occupied Palestinian territories, whatever you'd like to term it. I want to take one, the historical claim. The historical claim, as far as I know, takes Israel back to 1207 BCE with the Merneptah Stele that talks about the Pharaoh of Egypt destroying Israel. And Israel, for the first time in archaeology, is mentioned as a proof point of its existence. So we know Israel. I'm not talking about biblical stories or mythologies. I'm leaving all of that aside. But the first archaeological claim is 1207, if I think I remember it, of the Merneptah Stele, Pharaoh Merneptah. We know about the history right up through to the present point as a historical facet. You've overlaid now the legal claims to what we would, I believe, should be called the Third Jewish Commonwealth in that long history, and it is the Third Commonwealth, the modern state of Israel. Now we come to the West Bank, where politics now collides with history and legal claims. And Hugh, there are 2 million or so occupants of that West Bank who don't want Israel to rule over them. And this is where the conflict begins to seethe and bubble. And now that is expressed in a number of ways. The first is, if I understand it correctly, is the Camp David autonomy framework of 1978 Camp David Accords. Israel agrees with Egypt in its treaty that Israel will create autonomy in the West Bank for the locals. That autonomy is then transferred into a higher level of legal claim with the Oslo Accords that specifically talks about a voluntary limitation on Israel's part of control of that area with a view towards either full autonomy or some form of national stature. I hesitate to use the word state because I don't think it's in the documents, but towards an independent type of arrangement, and hence has created a Palestinian Authority.
Yeah.
So we've got all these claims colliding in this very, very, very small piece of turf. As a comedian once beautifully said it, when you look at an atlas, the only country in the world whose name can't be typed on its land because the land is too small for its name is Israel.
Yeah.
So we've got all of these collisions. How does whose land deal with all of these facets?
Right. Well, we do look at the Oslo Accords in a fair amount of detail and what was agreed in September 1993. And, the fact that Israel entered into the Oslo Accords meant that actually Israel wanted to see the Arabs living in what was then called the West Bank. They didn't want to rule over them. They wanted them to have autonomy. And that's really what Israel entered into.
Yeah.
But the real complication, and I would say that this is the torpedo that made the Oslo Accords unworkable, and that was the PLO was recognized as the sole representative of the Palestinian people. Now, actually, you mentioned that the Palestinians don't want Israel ruling over them, which by and large is true, but I wouldn't say it's universally true. But actually, they don't want the Palestinian Authority ruling over them either, because the PLO, its background as a terrorist organization, it was set up, and it was actually the KGB that were involved in setting it up. We don't go to that detail in Whose Land Part 2. If we make a Part 3, we'll probably look at that.
Yeah, the role of the Soviets in this history is, very intertwined with just
Absolutely.
with many elements, partly for Palestinian statehood, partly, of course, for their own designs, which are nefarious.
Yeah.
On that, yeah,
Well, the whole PLO Charter is based on the eradication of Israel. And Israel, in good faith, entered into Oslo, but they were dealing with a partner, the PLO, that actually had no intention of living peacefully side by side Israel, whether it was autonomously or even as a state. And this is really where the whole thing has unraveled.
but it's more. I think it's more complicated, if I may, Hugh. If we accept and it is a strong and uh, legal case for Jewish sovereignty in Israel, then how do we address the competing claim in the West Bank that legitimacy in modern statehood also derives from the consent of the population? So that if the Arab population of the West Bank don't want Israel to rule over them, and the PLO morphs into the Palestinian Authority, much like in the Jewish settlements morphed into national statehood. How do we separate these claims? How do we find a way of, if we accept them, as a way of some resolution moving forward? Or don't we?
Well, this actually could be, if we make a third part of Whose Land, we'll deal with this. The problem now is that, as far as Israel is concerned, I don't see it as a problem myself, has really gone off the idea of a Palestinian state altogether. I think it was problematic from day one, 13th of September, 1993, where statehood actually wasn't mentioned in those declaration of principles. But already the PLO was saying that they had a state and Jerusalem was its capital. The day after, they were saying that, actually. And their idea was the destruction of Israel, always has been. And this is why we have the complete impasse today where the lives of millions of what we call Palestinians in Gaza and Judea and Samaria have been brought up with this idea that they will one day replace Israel, and the land of Israel is Palestine. And of course, Hamas was later formed in 1988, which was before Oslo. And of course, they're against any sort of two-state solution anyway. They simply want to wipe Israel off the map. And that's what the 7th of October was really all about. Now, Israel has come to the point where they're not prepared to accommodate a Palestinian state at all, and quite understandably.
I mean, at this point, being in Israel last year and going again soon, I hope, these flights aren't cancer. At the time of recording, it's clear that withdrawal from Gaza was a fork in the road for Palestinian statehood. It's from the Israeli perspective.
Yeah.
Right, there's no question. Withdraw, and we're leaving at the behest of President Bush and Condoleezza Rice all of the technologies and industries that Israel had created in Gush Katif. We leave it to you, and let's see what you make of this. And it's not anything but opportunistic to have done that and to have made, a real chance for statehood as we understand it. But it didn't happen. And, the alternative road that Gaza took under Hamas's rule. Again, it's a problem in the West Bank right now that if Israel withdraws, Hamas will take over. And here we have, an even worse scenario, an unimaginably bad scenario, worse than what we have right now. So, your documentary shows that Israel is right in law, but diplomacy, peace processes, political realities, European pressure, the United Nations, dare I mention that word, are all telling us something else about this conflict. That Israel, as the strong party, must give more to the Palestinians. But if the Palestinians aren't interested, and it's a zero-sum game, if they're not interested in living with Israel, then, Hugh, what happens?
It's an enormously difficult situation. One of the interviews we shot, and you'll see him briefly in part 2, was with Dr. Mordecai Kedar. And if we go ahead and make a part 3, what we shot then, together with other ideas, we'll put in there. Now, he has come forward with the idea that the main Palestinian population centers, like Hebron, like Jericho, Nablus, Ramallah, and so on, are actually run by clan heads, Arab clan heads, who've had their clans in these centers for generations and generations, well before the state of Israel.
These are family clans with long heritage, like the 11 families around Gaza that Hamas has suppressed.
Yes. And Dr. Mordecai Kedar, his idea is the way that Israel does this, gives autonomy to these areas, a bit like Emirates, if you like. And they have autonomy. Frankly, he says this, and he's an expert on Arab culture. I know very little about it, if anything. And he says basically these families could quite capably, these clans could quite capably run these cities, if you like, almost like a state, but certainly with a high degree of autonomy. And that is the way forward. That's the way he sees it. Now, the $64,000 question is whether it would work or not.
Yeah.
No one can predict that.
Look, no one knows. And if Palestinian national aspirations are cohesive, then it wouldn't work because you would override the clan structures. But who knows, Hugh? At the heart of this, I think it's more and more clear that we face a religious war here.
Absolutely.
And that is the lesson I got out of the story of the 1929 Hebron massacre. As we said then, as I'm saying with you today, that October 7th was called by Hamas the Al-Aqsa flood, the same libel that has been used, for 100 years to incite people. If it is a religious war, then what of legal claims, Hugh? I mean, what of
But
that?
this is you see, what we call international law is basically a Western concept.
Yeah.
The Paris Peace Conference of 1919, a lot of this legal idea came out of that conference. I mean, there were degrees of international law even before that, but it's Western nations. Now, what we call international law and Sharia law are two totally different things. And under Sharia law, there shouldn't be a Jewish state. Even, funnily enough, even though the Quran itself, and I don't have any references in front of me, I have seen them, say that actually the land belongs to the Jewish people and one day they would return. That's even in the Quran itself. And yet, under Sharia law, because Israel under the Ottoman Caliphate certainly was under Sharia, if you like, it can't ever be anything else than that. So I think this is something that's not generally being recognized. Now that codifies it in my mind as a religious war, because on the one hand, you've got the West, which comes from a Judeo-Christian heritage, which sadly we're now abandoning it. That in itself is a huge, huge problem. And then on the other hand, you've got Sharia and you've got the desire of organizations like the Muslim Brotherhood on the one hand, Sunni Islam, and then the regime in Tehran on the other hand,
Shia Islam. Yes.
Shia Islam, and they both want to take the world over. And they say that openly. I'm not speculating on whether it's the case. They say it themselves.
You remind me of when Rabbi Sachs wrote about the dignity of difference. And he talked about how Christianity came to terms with itself and its more darker, world conquering desires, its more bloody background, how Judaism came to term with itself too. Because all our scriptures have terrible things in them as we see them today. Islam has yet to come to terms, it's seemingly so, that Islam as we know it has yet to come to terms with itself in that way and reconcile itself to modernity.
Although there are countries like the UAE, for instance, that is coming to terms with
Very,
itself.
very much so. There are changes afoot, but so long as you're not Christian in the UAE or Jewish, and you'll be okay. I mean, there's still issues, but they're coming to terms with it. So do you think that the conflict, and I know your documentary talks really about the legal basis and the need to make that case in a world of moral relativism and nihilism, right? That, a 10-second meme that outrages, that outrages you is in fact, the argument. And we know that that's the problem of our world. But, is the conflict about law? Is the conflict about religion? Or is it about something even more, Hugh?
Well, this is an area we don't touch on in Whose Land. I believe it's a spiritual one. I believe the bottom line is that it's a spiritual conflict. And if I can look at it from a biblical Christian point of view, and funnily enough, Orthodox Judaism actually does overlap in a sense. Many Orthodox Jews are looking for the Messiah to come. They believe there's a messianic age to come. And certainly as a Christian, I would go along with that. The difference where I would have with Judaism is that I believe that the identity of the Messiah has been revealed. But I'm not going to argue about that.
Yours is coming back to the table. Ours is coming through the door for the first time. So,
But that is really what I believe it's all about.
yeah. Yeah.
And then, of course, with Shia Islam, you've got the 12th Imam,
Yeah.
who is, if you like, the Islamic Messiah.
Yeah.
So you've got a spiritual conflict going on there. And I believe that is what underlines the whole thing.
Oh, that poor Messiah. When she comes, it's going to be an impossible job reconciling all of this. I don't doubt it for a minute.
Well, it's interesting.
Poor her.
There's several scriptures that say he rules the earth with a rod of iron.
Maybe, maybe not. As we like to say, God will help those who helps themselves, so long as it's done, in the right way. Hugh, I wanted to, and I'm going to ask you where we can see the film, and we'll go back in a second. But I like to draw lessons of leadership out of these interviews. So, for me, from this conversation, what is the responsibility of leaders generally, not just in the area, but what is the responsibility of leaders? Political, intellectual, narrative, the way they communicate when history, law, and lived reality point in very different directions. What is the responsibility of leaders in this time?
To really seek truth. Unfortunately, both because you can tell I'm British born, and I grew up in England, and until just 2 years ago, I'd spent another 25 years in Britain, and now we're in Australia. And all the time we were back in Britain, I followed politics here very closely. And I believe that one of the biggest problems in politics today is the abandonment of our Judeo-Christian heritage. And this is reflected in the passage of a number of laws over the last 20, particularly the last 25 years or so. And I believe that our political leaders, the government here, the government in Britain, and in most European countries as well, we need to get back to our Judeo-Christian roots. Melanie Phillips has had an awful lot to say about this. And Israel is, in one sense, really is the canary in the coal mine. I believe that what Israel is doing right now with this confrontation with Iran and with Iran's proxies is holding back the spread of Islam. And because Islam has spread right across Europe, I believe Britain's gone now. I'm actually quite glad not to be living in Britain at this moment in time. I believe an Islamic takeover, complete Islamic takeover of Britain is pretty well inevitable now. And this is one of the reasons why Israel has become so unpopular politically at the very top. You've got Keir Starmer kowtowing to the very large Muslim vote. You've got the same in this country too.
There is an element of having to deal with all your minorities in your society, and it's a complex conversation. I'm I think it's a more nuanced conversation around how we work with minorities that do or do not accord with your basic value systems, which is what I think is the issue here. I'm not sure if I would characterize everyone in the same brush, Hugh, and that's where you and I might have our differences, and that's fine. But the view that there are larger civilizational things at stake here, I think we all agree. Those certainly who understand that this particular conflict is a prism for so much more. It is a prism by which we see the world turn its back on the Jewish people. We do see it, certainly, the inversion of a moral world that always stood with women no matter what, unless you're Jewish now. We see much going on in our civilization that worries us. It's the challenge of our time, and it's the moment that we need to address. Hugh Kitson, documentary filmmaker, tell us firstly where we will be able to see Whose Land, and your previous documentaries, where will we be able to view them?
Right. I'll start with the latter part of it, because I made quite a number of documentaries, including a prequel, by the way, to The Forsaken Promise, which is called From Exile to Restoration.
Where do we see? Is that on YouTube? Can we just pick that up?
It's on our website to an organization which I founded, which is atikfafilms.com.
atikfafilms.com.
Yeah.
Okay.
And quite a number of those of my earlier films on Israel can be seen on that, including
Wonderful.
The Forsaken Promise and others as well. Now, as far as Whose Land is concerned, we've got a couple of screenings coming up in Melbourne. One on the 18th of May, which is a Monday night, and one on the 15th of June, which is also a Monday night. And you can purchase tickets for these screenings at Humanitics.
Okay. Okay. What about screenings in other cities?
Well, we had one in Sydney earlier this year. We haven't got anything else coming up, but you can look at it. You can look at the feature-length documentary on both parts on our website, which is www.whoseland.info. And also, we've split the two feature-length episode parts into 19 episodes, average of about 11 minutes each, which you can watch on our YouTube channel, which is youtube.com
Yes.
/@whoseland.
Okay. So we've got hatikfafilms.com for your previous documentary.
Yes.
Including Forsaken Promise, which is about the mandate. Then we've got whoseland.info about the current documentary series, and at Whose Land on YouTube, again, for more information about your documentaries.
Yeah.
Okay.
And you can watch free of charge the episodes of Whose Land, 19 of them altogether to this point in time.
Hugh Kitson, thank you for coming on Behind the Headlines. It's been a real education and a real deep dive into the legal and history and moral and spiritual and religious aspects of one of the most fascinating, difficult, challenging, but I always find optimistic issues facing the world today.
Can I say one other thing which I believe is very important? Part of what's going on in our education system, and I'm not just talking about Australia, certainly Australia, but Britain and America as well, and especially in tertiary education, Israel, of course, is branded as a colonialist enterprise and an apartheid state and so on. One of the reasons why this is allowed to happen is that there's a vacuum of really good material that is based on verifiable history.
Yes.
And I've made a couple of submissions to the Royal Commission that's going on at the moment. And one of them is to put this forward as a possible solution to that, to fill the real vacuum in our education curricula. I'd love to see it shown in Jewish schools, because I believe that it's very important for Jewish people to understand their history and their legal rights, which are being so challenged these days.
Hugh, that's very well said. It is incumbent on all of us to understand the many facets of the current conflicts that are here. And you focus with your documentary on the legal claims. And for that, we thank you and wish you well and good health. And may you
Thank you.
continue making great documentaries. Hugh Kitson, thanks for coming on Behind the Headlines.
Thank you, Adam.